Why does out of Africa still insist humans migrated into Eurasia only 60,000 years ago, despite well-dated archaeological evidence of modern humans in Arabia and the Levant over 120,000 years ago? Because acknowledging this evidence establishes continuity beyond Africa, and continuity is fatal to the model. If sapiens were present, persistent and evolving in the Levant and Arabian Peninsula before 100,000 years ago, that region would become ancestral rather than a failed migration. We need to stop pretending that out of Africa 50 or 60 or 70,000 years ago is an evidence-based theory. The out of Africa date is not evidence-driven, it is theory-driven. The 60,000-year date is therefore a containment line, imposed to prevent the Near East from being recognized as a long-term center of Homo sapiens evolution. The out of Africa theory is catastrophic for the understanding of human origins, because once you accept the evidence from Egypt, Arabia and the Levant into the story of modern human evolution, everything falls into place. The model must cling to a 60,000-year date because anything earlier exposes the Near East as evolutionarily continuous, undermines the 60,000-year bottleneck mythology, and reveals that out of Africa is not an empirical conclusion, but a chronological firewall erected to prevent the Near East from being recognized as a long-term engine of Homo sapiens evolution. The conventional story of early modern humans entering Eurasia has long rested on a misleading opposition. On one side stands sub-Saharan Africa as a presumed point of origin, and on the other stands Eurasia as a space supposedly blocked by Neanderthals until a late and triumphant breakthrough. The archaeological record from the Levant and Arabia does not support this framing. What it shows instead is a long-established human presence on both sides of the Red Sea boundary and a struggle over corridors rather than continents. The gateway into Eurasia was not sealed by Neanderthals. It was already occupied and effectively controlled by Levantine Homo sapiens, whose technological flexibility and ecological positioning made them the dominant force at the threshold. Arabia was the arena where this control was tested, reinforced, and ultimately selected for under climatic stress. The Mediterranean rim of Africa and the Nile-Red Sea region form the deep foundation of this history. These landscapes were not peripheral edges of a sub-Saharan core, but central arteries of long-term occupation and movement. The Nile-Red Sea, in particular, provided a continuous resource-rich region that allowed populations to remain connected across climatic cycles that repeatedly fragmented interior basins. Stone tool traditions along this axis show stability, refinement, and adaptability over hundreds of thousands of years. Levallois reduction systems appear early and persist, not as fragile experiments, but as robust traditions capable of adjustment. Such persistence requires demographic continuity and sustained social learning, conditions that corridor landscapes provide and that isolated interior regions do not. From this Mediterranean coast continuum, human populations were already positioned to expand in multiple directions well before the late Pleistocene. To the north, they entered the Levant, where Homo sapiens established a long-term presence that predates and overlaps Neanderthal occupations. To the south and east, Levantine-associated populations moved along the Red Sea margin, carrying with them a distinctive so-called Nubian technological package that would later appear in southern Arabia. These migrations did not originate in sub-Saharan interiors 70,000 years ago, where the out-of-Africa theory says they originated, so the standard out-of-Africa theory is incorrect. The Nubian Levallois tradition represents the southern expression of this Levantine expansion. It is a highly formalized stone tool system characterized by core preparation designed to yield triangular, pointed blanks with exceptional reliability. Its geographic distribution is tightly constrained and therefore highly informative. Nubian Levallois appears in the Middle Nile region, southern Egypt, and along the Red Sea coast of northeast Africa, and then crosses into southern Arabia. But, crucially, the dates of the oldest sites in Egypt and Arabia closely overlap around 130,000 years ago, so archaeologists cannot definitely say that the Nubian tools originated in Africa or Arabia. The tools could actually represent an Arabian or Persian Gulf migration into Africa, rather than an out-of-Africa migration. Nubian tools are found in Eritrea and coastal Ethiopia, but these are younger sites, not origin points. They could be called Arabian tools rather than Nubian. In Dhofar, Oman, the site of Aibut al-Awwal preserves a Nubian complex assemblage dated by optically stimulated luminescence to approximately 106,000 years ago. This date anchors Nubian firmly within the last interglacial and immediately after it, demonstrating that the Red Sea was an active corridor at this time rather than a hypothetical route. The Nubian system was not a generalist technology. It was optimized for producing points suitable for hafting and replacement, a strategy well suited to open landscapes and predictable hunting opportunities along linear corridors such as riverbanks and coastal plains. Its absence from the African interior and the Rift Valley is therefore not an accident of preservation. It reflects a strategic orientation toward environments where its advantages were maximized. Nubian populations followed water, shorelines, and open terrain, moving along the Red Sea margin and into southern Arabia during humid phases when the southern peninsula could support them. However, in the end, the Nubian presence in Arabia seems to be a failed migration from Africa and not the founding population of Homo sapiens. At the same time, a different but related adaptive package was firmly established in the Levant. Levantine Homo sapiens populations occupied caves, coastal zones, and inland valleys across the eastern Mediterranean. Their stone tool systems retained Levallois concepts but emphasized versatility rather than specialization. These assemblages produced a range of blanks suitable for multiple tasks and could be reconfigured according to raw material constraints and ecological conditions. This flexibility was not incidental. It was the defining feature that allowed Levantine populations to persist through environmental fluctuations and to maintain control over the principal land gateway between Africa and Eurasia. The Levant was therefore not a contested frontier held by Neanderthals against encroaching modern humans. It was a region repeatedly and persistently occupied by Homo sapiens. Neanderthals were present in adjacent regions and at times within the Levant itself, but the idea that they constituted a continuous human wall blocking dispersal is contradicted by the archaeological and fossil record. The real constraint on movement was not another hominin species. It was the structure of corridors and the capacity of populations to occupy and reoccupy them as conditions changed. Arabia reveals how this control operated in practice. Far from being an empty land bridge, the peninsula preserves evidence of repeated human occupation extending well beyond the last interglacial. In southeastern Arabia, the site of Jebel Fire documents a long sequence of Middle Paleolithic activity. Assemblage D, dated to roughly 210,000 years ago, demonstrates that humans were present in Arabia long before the appearance of Nubian or Levantine overlays. A later assemblage dated to about 125,000 years ago shows continuity through the last interglacial. Most strikingly, a further Middle Paleolithic occupation dated to approximately 80,000 years ago includes systematic production of elongated blanks described as blades. This indicates technological sophistication and planning depth at a time when environments were already becoming more challenging. Northern Arabia provides parallel evidence of repeated occupation tied to humid windows. In the Nafud Desert, Paleolake basins such as those at Karl-Ameyshan record multiple phases of human presence associated with different climatic episodes. At Karl-Ameyshan 4, distinct Middle Paleolithic assemblages are associated with occupations spanning from roughly 200,000 years ago to later phases around 75,000 and 55,000 years ago. These repeated entries show that northern Arabia functioned as an extension of the Levantine corridor, rather than as a one-time destination. The discovery of a Homo sapiens fingerbone at Al-Wusta, dated to approximately 90,000 years ago, provides direct biological evidence that modern humans occupied this northern Arabian landscape during one of these humid phases. Of course, the press releases framed this as an early out-of-Africa migration, but we already know humans were living in the Levant at this time, so framing this as out of Africa is not only invalid, it is outright dishonest. In the same region, archaeologists found modern human footprints dated to around 120,000 years ago, proving more confirmation of humans in Arabia. These northern Arabian occupations align closely with Levantine technological traditions and ecological strategies. They reflect populations capable of exploiting lakeside environments, moving flexibly across landscapes and persisting in refugial zones when aridity returned. This is the key to understanding why the gateway to Eurasia remained under Levantine Homo sapiens control. It was not a matter of defeating neanderthals. It was a matter of maintaining a resilient presence at the threshold while other strategies waxed and waned. The Persian Gulf adds a crucial but often overlooked dimension to this picture. During periods of low sea level, the Gulf was not a marine barrier but a vast low-lying basin fed by major river systems. It would have offered freshwater, vegetation and game at a scale unmatched elsewhere in Arabia. Its position between Mesopotamia, Arabia and Iran makes it an ideal demographic reservoir linking northern and southern routes. The later inundation of this basin erased the archaeological record of what may have been the most densely occupied and strategically important landscape in the region. The absence of evidence from the Gulf has distorted interpretations of Arabian prehistory by removing the very place where populations from the north and south could have met, mixed, or diverged. The decisive phase in this history occurred after approximately 75,000 years ago, when global climates shifted toward harsher and more unstable conditions. This period coincides with the eruption of the Toba volcano around 74,000 years ago and with the onset of a more arid climatic regime. Whether Toba alone caused demographic collapse is less important than the broader reality that habitats contracted and corridors fragmented. Under these conditions, the differences between Nubian and Levantine strategies became critical. The Nubian point-focused system, highly effective in open and predictable landscapes, lost its ecological footing as southern Arabia dried and resources became patchy. Nubian populations retreated toward the Nile and Red Sea margins, where corridor conditions persisted. Their technological signature faded from Arabia not because the people vanished, but because the environmental context that sustained their specialization no longer existed. In contrast, Levantine Homo sapiens populations persisted in refugial zones supported by caves, diverse microhabitats, and alternative resource bases. Their technological flexibility allowed them to weather demographic thinning and to re-expand when conditions permitted. This outcome is often misread as evidence that modern humans finally broke out of Africa after defeating Neanderthals. In reality, it reflects a much longer process in which Levantine Homo sapiens never relinquished control of the gateway in the first place. The Levant was not a wall to be breached. It was a home territory from which movements into Eurasia could occur whenever corridors opened. Arabia was the proving ground where different corridor-based strategies were filtered by climate, and the Persian Gulf was the missing center, whose loss obscures the full demographic picture. Interior Africa, including regions associated with fossils such as Herto and Bodo, occupies a different role in this framework. These sites document important stages in hominin evolution and regional persistence, but they do not function as sources for large-scale Eurasian expansion. They represent hinterlands in demographic terms, preserving older lineages and mosaics, while corridor populations along the Mediterranean, Nile and Red Sea drove repeated movements and technological continuity. The absence of clear dispersal signatures radiating from deep sub-Saharan interiors into Arabia reinforces this distinction. When the later global expansion of Homo sapiens finally accelerated, it drew on populations already adapted to corridor living, maritime movement and ecological flexibility. These populations were shaped by generations of selection along coasts, rivers, and gateway regions. The sea, not the savanna, structured their world. The decisive threshold into Eurasia was therefore never blocked by Neanderthals. It was already occupied by Levantine Homo sapiens, whose resilience and adaptability allowed them to endure climatic catastrophe and to remain positioned at the crossroads of continents. In this light, the so-called out-of-Africa event dissolves into a longer and more complex process. There was no single exit, no singular homeland, and no final breach of a hostile frontier. There was an evolutionary contest played out across corridors, with Arabia as the arena and climate as the arbiter. Nubian and Levantine strategies emerged from a shared corridor-based population, diverged in response to ecological opportunities, and were filtered by environmental collapse. The survivors were those who could hold the gateways. Human history did not begin with a march out of sub-Saharan Africa 50,000 years ago. It marched out from the Near East. Thanks for watching.